was the child of Tut. In the Hebrew language, the word mos means to draw out. And so maybe Pharaoh's daughter just she sounds like this kind of spunky, vivacious young lady here. So maybe she thinks it's a pretty funny play on words to combine both Hebrew and Egypt in this little name, this little clever name for a Hebrew boy raised in an Egyptian home who was drawn out of a child drawn out of the water. And so it becomes Moses, a Hebrew boy raised in Pharaoh's home. Back then, the pharaohs were expected to have many children and raise up the males to rule in the military and civic realms. Going back to Acts 7:22 for a moment, Stephen says that Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. And so Moses' role in the plan of God began with him receiving the best training in the world. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that's what God needed Moses to be trained in. In fact, we're going to see as we look at the end of this chapter in the next week, that God takes the next 80 years for Moses to unlearn the ways of the Egyptians to relearn the ways of God. But the first point here is showing us what it looks like for Amram and Jochebed to seek God's wisdom, to obey God's commands. They're in this desperate situation. They've sought the Lord, and he gives them wisdom to save the life of her son. And he works in this situation in a way that shows everyone, and will always show Moses, that his salvation was by the hand of God and not the plans of man. Yeah, it was a good idea. But what really happened, that was God. There's no other way to explain how things unfold. And so although this seems like a wonderful outcome for Moses, this wonderful outcome would have to be the very outcome that Moses would have to forsake as he pursued his purpose and his role and work in the plan of God. So let's go to our second point this morning, the wisdom to forsake what is not of God. The wisdom to forsake what is not of God. When God works in a person's life, he'll show them often the things that need to go because they're not of him. There's a famous book that was mostly produced about 30 years ago called My Heart, Christ's Home. In that booklet, the author illustrates, he puts in a story form what it's like for Christ to take up residency within the home of a person in their heart, and how the Lord goes through life kind of pointing out the things that need to go for the Lord to rightly live in that person's heart. I read that book as a new believer, and it had a powerful impact on me because it showed me that there were a ton of things in my life that were not of the Lord and needed to go. We see Moses making this same journey over the next several verses. Thinking about what Moses grew up in and what it would have been like, it's hard to imagine the disparity or the discontinuity between the sophistication Moses grew up in and the poverty of his people just a stone's throw away. At the time, Egypt was the most advanced society in that region of the world, if not the entire world. The pyramids are still considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They're still around today. They had toothpaste, which meant that they had decent teeth and good breath. They wore eyeliner and nail polish. They were the first people in that part of the world to use mirrors. They even did brain surgery that people survived from. And so Moses was raised in this incredibly sophisticated world, while at the same time, his own people were enslaved in poverty. And so in verse 11, Moses is now becoming this man of prominence, and he's burdened for the iniquities of his people. And so verse 11 says, "Now came about in those days when God had grown up, then he went out," so when Moses had grown up, "and that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren." Let's kind of unpack some of the words in this verse here. The phrase "grown up" here, is the word that's forming that phrase is a word to mean great or important or to do great things. It could be age, it could be size, but it's in this context here, it's more than that. It's about prominence. The point is that Moses has grown up and become a prominent person in society. He's a prominent man in society. He's a prominent man of Pharaoh's household, and he begins to put all this together and see his mission and purpose in life. Back in Acts 7, verse 25, Stephen refers to Moses' mindset saying, he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. And so here in verse 11, Moses went out to see what was going on with his brethren. The phrase went out there emphasizes that Moses went out intentionally to figure out what was going on with his people. He wasn't just on his way to the store and just happens to see some atrocity going on. He is going out on an intentional reconnaissance mission to find out how are they doing and start to work on his role in delivering them. The words looked on in verse 11 means to see and perceive and feel and understand. Moses wanted to see the condition of his people because he had reached this place in life where he could finally do something to help them. He's this prominent man in Pharaoh's household. So why not use his position and power and influence to save his people, to help his people? And so he goes out. And with that seeing, perceiving, and understanding, he sees what it looks like. Oh, I see what's going on here. An Egyptian taskmaster is beating a Hebrew slave. This is how it goes. Thinking about Moses and his own training. He's probably been trained in hand-to-hand combat. He knows how to handle this situation. And so it says he looked this way and that. What's that mean? We could speculate. Maybe he's looking to see if anyone will help him. Maybe he's looking to see if anyone's going to help this guy. Maybe he's looking to see if he's not going to get caught. Maybe no one will find out. And so he decides to deal with this matter in the way that he's been trained. This is going to be the way of the Egyptians, the way of the flesh, the way of violence, the way of trusting himself. And so Moses kills this Egyptian and hides him in the sand. Best place to get rid of him, cover him in sand. No time to dig a grave, let's get going. So that's what goes on here. The question is this okay? It's hard to say. It's harder to say than you might think. I've heard a lot of sermons condemning Moses' actions right here. Moses has no authority, no legitimate authority to take matters into his own hands. And capital punishment, so to speak, without due process is just plain old murder, and murder is wrong. So Moses was wrong to do this. I've heard other sermons commend Moses' actions. This Hebrew slave was really being beaten. We're called to defend the innocent, those who can't defend themselves. And so Moses has the right idea, it's just the wrong time. Well, the passage doesn't tell us if this is right or wrong. I'm not aware of any passage. I looked, I couldn't find any passage that commends or condemns what Moses does here. In fact, the only passages that speak about this event are Acts 7 and Hebrews 11, both of our passages we read this morning, and neither one commend or condemn. They actually refer to something different. So if you keep your bulletin here in Exodus 2, let's go to Acts 7, and I'm going to look at then Hebrews 11 after that, because I think it's helpful to look at these verses here and see what they want us to focus for what happens in this event here. So Acts 7, verse 23 is what we're going to be looking at, 23 to 25. Acts 7:23 says, "But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand." Hebrews 11. Let's go to Hebrews 11 now. Hebrews 11, another quarter of an inch over. If you see like lists of tables and things that have gone too far. Hebrews 11, looking at verse 24, says, "By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." And so the only two passages I'm aware of that refer to this event don't even evaluate if Moses is doing right or wrong here in defending this Hebrew slave. Instead, they want us to focus on Moses' identification with the children of Israel and his awareness of his responsibility to deliver them, even if that meant giving up all of the riches and prestige that were his in the Egyptian world. In other words, Moses has grown up in the lap of luxury with a silver spoon in his mouth, but he has to give up all of that to obey God, and he gives up all of that to join with the people of God and be a part of God's plan. God often calls us to identify with the people of God. We're gathering on a Sunday morning. We're identifying with the people of God. There are times when we may see a believer at work or at school or somewhere else do something that is being mocked by the world, but we know that what they're doing is what Christ calls us to do. God is calling us to recognize that that's a brother or sister in the Lord, and to identify ourselves with the people of God, even when they're being mocked by the world around us. And it's not always going to go well. It's not always going to go easy. Can be kind of challenging at times. That's what we see here in this passage. So going back to Exodus chapter 2, here's where we see how God is going to have to give Moses a faith that is able to carry him through this difficulty that's going to come from his identification with the people of God. Because at first glance, when we look at this passage here, going back to verses 13 and 14, it looks like Moses just, because when he commits that action to kill that taskmaster, that's it for him in Egypt. And at first glance, it looks like Moses just gives up all of that for nothing, because the next two verses show us that the people didn't want Moses to deliver them, and they didn't care about the sacrifice that he just made for them. So going back to Exodus 2:13, it says the next day, this is bang, bang, bang. Moses goes out, sees two Hebrews fighting with each other. He can't believe what he's seeing because these are the people of God. They should have peace with each other. They should stand with each other, not tear each other down. So he says to the offending one, why are you striking down your companion? Stephen, again, in Acts 7:26 says he's trying to reconcile them in peace, but they would have nothing to do with his leadership. And the guy who is perpetrating this hostility turns to Moses and says in verse 14, who made you prince and judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? This guy didn't care about Moses or his training or the sacrifices he had just made for the people of Israel. He didn't want Moses as his prince, as his judge. Moses had just given up everything to identify himself with the people of God, but this guy wasn't even willing to give up the right to win an argument. This guy wasn't going to make any sacrifices for his fellow man. And he's essentially ridiculing Moses for the sacrifices he made. You gave that up. You had it all. You gave it up for what? For us? I would never do something like that. And this is a problem. Because if this man reflects the heart of the people of God, then at this point they want nothing of his leadership. And so verse 14 ends with Moses being afraid, saying, surely the matter has become known. And he's got good reason to be afraid, because in verse 15 it says, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. Now, the text doesn't specifically spell out the specific aspect of the matter that was a concern to Pharaoh, but we can pretty much surmise that Pharaoh was not pleased that this man who had so generously grown up in Pharaoh's home chose to leave all that privilege behind and identify with the Jews and even resort to lethal force to deliver them or protect them. Pharaoh's like, that's it. Just kill him. And so in this, Moses then flees to Midian. Now here's where Hebrews 11:27 gives us a window into Moses' reasonings for fleeing. Hebrews 11:27 says, by faith he, speaking of Moses, left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. And so Moses has this prevailing faith, this eyes on God faith. He is not in fear in verse 14 of Pharaoh, but of something else. Verse 14 is clear. Moses was afraid that